Welcome everyone to Creative Accessibility. For those who don't know, this is a partnership between Arts Accessibility Network Manitoba and Creative Manitoba, where every spring we bring some workshops about accessibility in the arts and that sort of thing. So today we are luckily joined by Sean Lee from Tangled Arts and Disability. But first, we're going to start with a quick land acknowledgement. So Arts Accessibility Network Manitoba and Creative Manitoba is located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Assinanu, Dakota, and Dene people and the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. We note that Treaty 3 is where Winnipeg receives its water supply, and most of our electricity is taken from Treaty 5. We aim to move forward in solidarity with Indigenous people to address the continued harm perpetuated by colonialism. As I mentioned, today we are welcoming Sean Lee, who's going to be talking about Tangled Arts and Disability. Sean Lee, he/they, is an artist and curator exploring the assertion of disability art as the last avant-garde. His methodology explores crip culture practices as a means to resist normative identities. Idealities. That's a tough word for me. Sorry about that, Sean. Orienting towards a crip horizon, Sean's practice explores the transformative possibilities of access aesthetics in an embodied politic that can desire the ways disability disrupts. Sean is currently the Director of Programming at Tangled Art plus Disability. He holds a BA in Arts Management and Studio from UTSC. Sean is also an independent curator, writer, lecturer, and advisor, adding his insights and perspectives on disability and accessibility to conversations across Canada, the US, and internationally. Sean serves on the board of the Toronto Arts Council and CARFACT Ontario, and is chair of TAC, which is TAC, Visual and Media Arts Committee. He is currently a member of the City of Toronto's External Advisory Plan for the Action Plan for Toronto's cultural sector. Thank you so much, Sean, for joining us, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, Janelle. Hi, everyone. My name's Sean. As Janelle mentioned, I'm the Director of Programming at Tangled Art and Disability. Tangled has a sign name, and it's this, just given that little bit of context. And yeah, so I'm based in Toronto, also now known as Toronto. We're on Treaty 13 territory. Toronto means where there are trees standing in the water in Mohawk, and is located on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And before we begin, I want to start off with a quick image description of myself first. So I'm somebody who's male presenting. I use he and they pronouns. I'm an East Asian Chinese person with relatively light skin. I'm also somebody who's visibly disabled. So my back curves, my shoulders are uneven. If we were meeting in person, you probably notice I'm very short of stature. And also I have black like dark brown hair that goes past my shoulders. I'm wearing these like steampunk glasses. They're these like brown glasses with gold rims that sort of float on the frames. And I'm wearing a black t-shirt. And folks can't really see that on the frame, but it says the future is accessible. I actually wear this like all the time when I'm giving presentations. It's a shirt by a disability YouTuber named Annie Sagara, and I just love it because it's kind of a very fun thing to wear when you're going to be talking about accessibility, about creative access. And so with that note, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can talk about what we're here to talk about today. So I just shared my screen. Does everyone, for everyone here, what's happening, what should be happening is that there's now a white screen with black text that says on creative access and accessible curatorial practices. Is that about right for everyone? Yep. Okay, great. I'm getting some thumbs up. So I'm just going to go through some of the slides, and just for access, I am going to do my best to give a quick line of like alt text for every slide that I'm presenting. So the next slide is just my name, my position at Tangled. So I'm going to start with just a couple of access protocols. So on the screen, it says this text is size 18. This is the minimum size for presentation text that I use anyways. And then all images and text contrast strongly with background colors. I'll do my best to use plain language throughout the presentation, but if there is anything that you'd like me to repeat or clarify, feel free to either you can unmute and ask, or you can throw something in the chat. I'll try to monitor it and answer it at like kind of a natural break. Or feel free, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function to either message me or any of the moderators. So that would be Janelle or Kara, either privately or to everybody if you have any questions. So if there are any other ways that folks here think I could make this more accessible, you're very welcome to send me or to everyone a note in the chat. I'll let folks marinate on that as I continue on with this presentation, but if anything does come up, let me know. So a little note on this practice, actually. I always make it a point to include some access protocols in any presentations I give. I find that it helps just kind of to model some of the things that we're talking about in today, you know, practices like visual descriptions, like the one that I gave, for instance, just help mitigate some of those normative assumptions of who's present or participating or leading in these kinds of spaces. And, you know, visual description is just part of like a big host of cultural practices that were really created and established by disability community as a way to hack the lack of accessibility in a lot of our kind of day-to-day encounters. And that's really what the crux of what I'm going to talk about today, is that this sort of hacktivist spirit can really inform our approaches to access and help us to desire disability rather than try to hide its presence in our cultural ecosystem. In order to talk about accessible practices, in order to talk about creative access, I think I really have to start with this idea of what is disability art. So on the screen, I've got a couple of definitions because I really don't think you can nail down disability arts in a single succinct definition. I've got disability arts disrupts the single story of disability in favor of many ways of disability, represents disability as diverse, nuanced, and complex, is about gaining control over how we are represented in culture, asks us to think differently about how we create art and experience culture, and I think probably to me the most important one, disability art is created by disabled people. These points of definition are things that I've gained over my time here at Tangled, learning from mentors like Eliza Chandler, who was a past artistic director at Tangled, learning from amazing artists like Birdie Girl and other artists who I'll cite throughout this presentation. And I like to discuss what disability arts is, because I think to understand crip curatorial practices, to understand crip arts movements, we have to understand the disability arts movement. And although, I haven't given us any single definition that captures disability arts, it is sort of generally agreed that disability arts is this specific practice which involves disabled artists creating work. Oftentimes, this is work that expresses our identities as disabled folks and carries this meaning that as disability arts practitioners, we're moving our work forward, either individually or collectively, and contributing to this movement, which is disability arts, and towards the expression of a disability culture with its own unique experiences and perspectives and shared values. And I will just preface that when I say disability arts, even that doesn't capture it enough, right? I'm using this as an umbrella term to talk about deaf community, MAD community, folks from neurodivergent, sick and spoony culture, disability culture. And so there are so many folks that are coming together through this term that I'm using, each having their own communal enactments, many of which include accessibility as a vital kind of cultural contract with one another. And so I'm going to move to the next slide. This is a photo. I think this is a really powerful photo of our first exhibition at Tangled. This was Constructed Identities by Persimmon Blackbridge. There is there's about 5 gray panels of these figurative sculptures. They're made out of found objects like different kinds of Barbie dolls, wood, scrap metals, food, and different kinds of carved wood. The figures all sort of reference the human body, but they're abstract in terms of like the shape, the construction, and how they're put together. And as I was sort of saying, I use disability arts as an umbrella term to unpack all the different ways that disability has and continues to be understood as something that can be cultural. And some of the values of the disability arts movement really formed in reaction to the ways that disabled, mad, deaf folks have historically been marginalized. And this applies to the art world too. A lot of artists are coming into disability arts having only ever heard that disability arts is art therapy or that it's outsider art. And historically, crip artists have really been silenced, othered, or stripped of agency as people who create and shape culture. These are because of these very paternalistic paradigms. And so the implication has always really been that art is good for disability. Art is therapeutic for disabled folks. Art is a way to, engage with folks who otherwise can't engage with the world. And disability art really helps to flip this switch. And that's what I want to identify today, is that it helps us to understand disability is actually good for art. I've got a photo here of the Venus de Milo. Venus is this nearly nude female figure posed in kind of a classical S-curve. Significantly, the Venus de Milo is a sculpture that doesn't have arms. And to the right of that, I've got a definition of disability aesthetics. So it says here, modern art continues to move us because of its refusal of harmony, bodily integrity, and perfect health. And this is a quote from Tobin Siebers. And what I'm trying to identify here with this quote is that very significantly, art in the Western world has sort of always recognized the aesthetic potential of disability and disabled bodies, or the quote unquote broken body. And as Tobin Sievers, who's a disability scholar, kind of argues, is that disability aesthetics aren't just a question of the representation of disability in art, because that's sort of been a trope that's been very highly visible for time immemorial, disability as a trope for human vulnerability or imperfection. But instead, disability aesthetics challenges these tropes by centering the disabled experience and ways of knowing as critical frameworks that treat disability as an aspect of human variability with very intrinsic value. And what Siebers says is that disability aesthetics doesn't embrace genius or bodily integrity or health as these standards of beauty. But instead, it's broadening this idea and affirming that disability can operate as a very critical framework for questioning aesthetic presuppositions in the history of art. And Siebers's conception of disability aesthetics often gets widely taken up in disability arts to recognize the very integral place and fullness of disability in culture. It helps us to understand that beauty that maintains an underlying sense of disability can actually work to renew art that risks falling out of fashion because of changing standards of taste, and can be this provocation and this presence that allows the beauty of an artwork to endure over time. One of the questions that comes up, and why I use the example of the Venus de Milo, is because the question is, would the Venus de Milo still be so aesthetically compelling if this was a figure that had both arms, that was preserved in a way that wasn't, that had no, presence of disability? But I do also want to emphasize that disability aesthetics is not the same as disability art. Disability art isn't just this practice of making, it's actually a way of knowing. And I want to talk about this idea of disability arts as the last avant-garde, because it's really been a vehicle to transform the art world in very expansive ways that go beyond what Tobin Siebers' original understanding of disability aesthetics gave us all those years ago. In 2007, there was a disability artist named Yinka Shonibare, who is this incredible Turner Prize nominated artist in the UK. Yinka very boldly declared that disability arts was the last remaining avant-garde movement. And this was on a panel where Yinka sort of followed this observation up, and by paralleling the emergence of disability arts in the last few years with the emergence of feminist arts, Black arts, queer arts movements in the 1960s, which were all these very powerful vehicles for social change. And what I think is that disability arts really holds the power to help us to imagine different realities, new realities, and acts as this gateway to these worlds of alterities. And this is where I'd like to start talking about just my own experience of encountering disability arts, and also talk about the development of Tangled as a way of understanding how some of the practices that we've engaged shape creative access, shape accessible curatorial practices, and think about how some of these methodologies can really work to reinvigorate our art sector more broadly. So I've got in the next photo here, this is a photo of a performance we did called Brownton Abbey. It was part of our 2019 Cripping the Arts Symposium. Really love this image. We've got Ebony Rose Dark in this spandex suit, this very complicated tiara. They're bathed in red light, clutching their hair in this kind of model pose. And behind them, there's a dark blue screen with white text that reads VIP. Now, usually we associate the acronym VIP with the words very important person. That's sort of the most well-known acronym for VIP. But Ebony, who identifies as a visually impaired person, is kind of subverting that acronym with their own experience and conflating the two. And so I really love the way that this is framed in this sort of very vogue ballroom aesthetic. It's just a beautiful image. Um, uh, so going back though, this idea of the VIP, I think, is really why I wanted to use this image to talk about my own experience of coming to Tangled. And just as a bit of history, Tangled was actually started in 2003 when a group of cultural makers, community members all came together to form the Abilities Arts Festival, which was this sort of very international festival that took place once a year in Toronto. The festival was very much led by a crowd of dedicated, able-bodied enthusiasts who really wanted to create a sense of disability pride. And Abilities was very successful at what they did. They made waves in the city in a time long before there were, more official whisperings of a disability arts sector that was more formally recognized. And as years passed, Abilities crowds grew, and lots of other disability arts organizations around that time were also cropping up. And so, the arts councils really began to take notice. The Canada Council in particular was really beginning to recognize a very different set of needs when it came to engaging disability and deaf communities. So around 2005, Canada Council, thanks to a lot of the advocacy work done by folks associated with abilities and with Kickstart in Vancouver, like really began to create specific arts funding opportunities in 2005 with disability community, and more specifically in 2007 with deaf communities. And so these have trickled down to, for instance, Ontario Art Council and Toronto Arts Council. But what I want to identify is really a shifting politic as well, because around the 2010s, around the early 2010s, Abilities hired another staff member, Rina Fraticelli, as their artistic executive director. Like all the artistic executive directors before, Rina was somebody who was able-bodied, but recognized that it was actually vital that disability arts organizations have leadership from the community. And so it was Rena's goal to replace herself with a disabled artistic leader. And it was here that in 2013, Eliza Chandler was hired. And this was a very significant shift that made Tangled at the time what we understood to be the first disability-led disability arts organization. It's a little bit mind-boggling to think about today, but that was sort of the place that disability arts was sort of at the time. It also meant that Tangled's politics were really changing, was really trying to become disability justice driven. And we changed our name to Tangled as a way to identify the ways in which the disability community, like a tangle, can be messy, can be intricate, can remain happily tangled, but creates a through line in which we all experience the different ways in which disability manifests. And there is no singular disability arts movement, but we all share in these lived experiences. And I also think that disability arts is situated in a way that it sort of naturally falls in line with some of the other movements of the art sector here in Toronto, on Turtle Island. There's a strong culture of artist-run centers And these are all, supported through arts councils. Each have their own history of counterculture and celebrating innovative practices. And so I think this really falls in line with the space that Tangled is trying to create. About a year after Eliza Chandler became the artistic director, they put on a really well-received festival in 2014, and after that festival, Tangled was offered our own gallery space. This was in the 401 Richmond building. 401 is this hub for artist-run centers, feminist arts organizations, indigenous cultural organizations, a lot of very influential arts organizations all are housed here. And so having a gallery space was very significant to us in providing a very significant boost in our capacity to showcase disability arts, to gather community, to create, an opportunity for developing accessible curatorial practices. And so having a space like Tangled means we can do more experimenting. We have year-round programming, and we're able to foreground access in ways that we couldn't previously in a festival model. We're also now an organization that's staffed entirely by folks with lived experience, folks from the disability, mad, deaf, neurodivergent community. And so that cultivation of disability leadership from within, I think, has also allowed us to experiment and remain nimble in what access means, and gives us the opportunity to define crip aesthetics within our own terms. There's a disability curator named Amanda Kashia who talks about this idea of crip aesthetics as not being just about the content of the works of art or the lived experiences of the artists who represent disability. But what Amanda says is that rather a crip orientation actually disables, quote unquote, the very logics of curation and gallery space. And so that's where we're going to talk about things like creative access and other accessible curatorial practices. I've got the next image here. This is Big Softy by Birdie Girl. Birdie created this huge soft sculpture, bulbous 12-foot sculpture that's made of these very tactile, soft, dimpled, stuffed knee socks and nylon stockings. It's accompanied by the unidentified remains, which are these like very fleshy pieces of unfired terracotta clay. There's two photos, one kind of zoomed in to Big Softy's guts, in which hands are kind of playing with these stuffed knee socks and holding the unidentified remains. At the center of it all is Big Softy's heart. It's this like red patchwork soft sculpture. It's little tendrils extending. And on the photo to the right is just another angle of Big Softy laid out on the table. So this, I think, is a great example of creative access. And creative access is a word coined by Amanda Kachia to identify the ways that access can be creative methodology. Creative access really is a pillar of disability arts curation. And it's a practice I first learned about at Tangled, where the aesthetics of access can actually be this very generative site of meaning making. Creative access asks us to understand accessibility as a robust artistic experience rather than something that is like an add-on or that's part of a checkbox of best practices. Now, in order to have a meaningful engagement with the aesthetics of access, I also think that means you have to create an environment where the practice can thrive, where artists are properly supported and considered, where there are robust exhibition fees, curators, and community members that can help provide expertise so that we can incorporate access creatively and effectively from the very beginning stages of our work, rather than kind of this standardized and unchanging logistic to which we try to always perfectly comply to and never have to think critically about. We're understanding that access can instead be very fruitfully brought into exhibitions and imagined from the beginning stages of exhibition making and planning. I also think creative access really helps motivate curators and exhibition programmers to take on the work of access more meaningfully because it's exciting. It doesn't water down the significance of providing conventional access, but instead is about how accessibility can also be practical and creative at once. In the photo that I'm using here, Birdie was conceiving of these very complex ways that audience members might want to engage with her work. Audience members could pick up one of the sculptural tendrils. They could squeeze and rearrange it. There were these squeaky toys embedded throughout that would create a sound response to how people held the works. And also on the backs of a lot of the paintings and the drawings, Birdie had created what she calls these captain's logs. Now, in this exhibition, we had over 100 paintings and drawings, and so creating conventional audio description would have meant creating kind of like a 3-hour long audio descriptive track, and that really didn't feel like the intention of this exhibition. Instead, we took the through a creative access approach, we took the captain's logs and we created an audio description narrative. We created a sound station that became its own work, and it was meant to be complemented by the tactility of Big Softy and help to create this liminal sort of sensory space, not necessarily attempting to replicate the experience of some of the soft body horror drawings that were in the exhibition, but instead create a new experience, one that was tailored for this sense, for a different kind of sense, and deprioritize the visual in this artistic experience. Another example of this is an exhibition called The Scales That Fall From Our Eyes. It was on during this season. This is a photo of a series called Soft Spoken. Now, there's 4 canvases. These are all Braille, lined in a row, that Olivia hand-painted using a tactile paint. Olivia is a blind low vision artist who has been thinking about how we can bring in blindness arts aesthetics into a quote unquote visual art gallery. And working with an artist like Olivia was a very powerful experience because it allowed us to continue reevaluating our own artistic practices and our own ways of understanding the gallery. Here with Olivia, what we were able to do was Olivia had proposed to us that we have these white wooden blocks beneath every interactive work as a way to signal to cane users who were blind or partially sighted or low vision that there was an interactive work on the wall. This was this really simple, clean, wonderful intervention into our space that we hadn't thought of, in all these years that we had a gallery. It really took the creativity and the knowledge, the hacking that comes from your own, like a community member, to suggest these ways in which we can rethink and reorient the gallery. And so I bring this up because now, this whole season and going forward, this is a practice that we want to embed into all of our exhibitions. This is a recent practice that we're embedding. And so if you look at a toolkit that we may have helped author years ago, this isn't something that's going to be found. And this is why we can't just use a checklist. We can't just have this thing that never grows or never changes, because we have to always continue revisiting access, and we have to take on access as something that is political. And so to really address this politic of disability, we have to also understand ableism. And I have this definition of ableism that's been presented to us from disability justice activists. You may have experienced this yourself. You may have heard of this or seen this definition before, but I really think it's a very powerful one. I'm going to read it out. It's just on this sort of purple background, defined like you would any dictionary definition. It says ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and or their ability to satisfactorily produce or reproduce, excel, and quote unquote behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So this is a working definition by Talila T.L. Lewis, last updated in January 2021. It was developed in community with disabled Black and other negatively racialized people, especially Dustin Gibson. And I think this is a really important definition because it underscores the ways that ableism is systemic. And Birdie and other disability artists are engaging access in these very fun, generative, meaningful ways that push beyond like mainstream definitions of access that rely heavily on compliance. Compliance really being the tool of disability rights. Now, I say this because compliance-based access is something that's really had to manifest due to under the terms of capitalism. You know, systems like what we have in Ontario, which is the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the Canada Accessibility Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act in the States. These are all legislative pieces that have very limited and spotty enforcement. These are all, incredible coups that were brought to us by the disability rights movement, but the disability rights movement had to be, going through all these legislative pieces has ended up being watered down into this sort of checkbox methodology in which access is mobilized through a set of logistical and standardized ways of understanding how we can create access. And while these sort of minimum accessibility standards mean that, disabled folks can maybe get through the door of an inaccessible building, they often don't address this compulsory able-bodiedness that exists in our existing built environments. They also may have inadvertently, promoted this idea that disabled folks can be standardized, that oftentimes this idea of disabled people comes across now as being de facto white, heteronormative, middle class, and almost always physically disabled because of this need to create a set of standards. And so, disability justice really emerged in response to this perceived single issue approach to disability. And this is a movement that's emerged in the last 10, 15 years, led by queer and trans BIPOC folks, and has given us different understandings of ableism, like the one that I've just talked about here. And in this definition, you know, disability justice activists are really emphasizing the systemic ways that ableism is interconnected and has to be integrated into our analysis of oppression and marginalization, and asks us to shift our understanding of access away from these very individualized and independence kind of understood notions of access, and instead work towards understanding accessibility as collective and interdependent, and working towards changing the very systems that enable ableism. A good way to understand kind of what I'm talking about here is from a very eloquent disability writer, Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Sumarasinghe. There's this article that Leah wrote called "To Survive the Trumpocalypse, We Need Wild Disability Justice Dreams." And I really love what she says here, which really articulates, I think, this idea that disability justice is not just about sliding disabled people into normative culture. She says, you want to know how you're doing disability justice. You'll know you're doing it because people will show up late, someone will vomit, someone will have a panic attack, and nothing will happen on time because the ramp is broken on the supposedly accessible building. You won't meet your benchmarks on time or ever. We won't be grateful to be included. We'll want to set the agenda. And what our leadership looks like may include long, sick, or crazy leaves, being nuts in public, or needing to empty an ostomy bag, being on Vicodin at work. It's slow. It's people, even the most social justice-minded abled folks, staring at or getting freaked out by us. It looks like what many mainstream able-bodied people have been taught to think of as failure. And so I have a bit of a 15-minute warning, so I'm going to start diving into some examples. I'm going to bypass this slide, but it says, we don't want to simply join the ranks of the privileged. We want to dismantle those ranks and the systems that maintain them. This is a quote by Mia Mingus, and I think this will best be embodied through this example I'm talking about here. This is a curatorial statement by Gloria C. Swain. It was from an exhibition called Hidden. And here I'm just gonna say there's a wall with in the foreground of this photo. It just has text on it along with headphones and an ASL monitor. And then in the background are artworks from the rest of the exhibition. I'm not going to talk about what's in the text because I'll talk about that now. Or I'm not going to read what's in the wall text, but because I'm going to talk about it. So as I've sort of mentioned already, beyond just the experience for audiences, disability arts is really about challenging the inherent ways that the art sector is inaccessible. It's about creating systemic institutional critique. And I often turn to Gloria, who was a past artist in residence at Tangled, and who was invited back to curate an exhibition. Gloria identifies as an aging Black madwoman. She describes her practice as one that is about creating opportunities for conversations about Black mental health. Oftentimes, this is in response to really an absence of anti-Black racist mental health services. And so in 2019, we invited Gloria back to curate, with curation being really an extension of her very robust community-based artistic practice. Now, Gloria, I think, really identified this idea of, or was really tapping into the definition of ableism being part of an anti-Black system that assigns value based on our ability to produce and behave. And in the curatorial statement for Hidden, Gloria really identified that this exhibition was about exploring intergenerational trauma, hauntology, isolation, and lived experiences of Black artists with hidden disabilities. And this was really tested during our time working together when one of the artists that Gloria had initially invited um, wasn't able to attend any of the prep meetings and wasn't able to get back to Gloria, and ultimately decided to withdraw because they weren't at a place at that time to participate in an exhibition. Now, there's still plenty of time to bring in another artist, but rather than drop the artist, Gloria came to us and asked about, the number of artists and, trying to understand if there were other ways that we could hold space for this artist. And, eventually we came to the idea that maybe it's an empty wall. And Gloria said, well, maybe I'll work on a statement. And she created this beautiful statement about how neoliberal, capitalist, and sanus ableist systems can exclude some artists. Many times, Black, mad, disabled artists from being able to participate in cultural institutions. And so instead of removing the artists, this wall was meant to hold space for them. The artist was offered a portion of their artist fee and acknowledged for the work that they'd done. And I think that in a lot of ways, Gloria was trying to provide access in a way that, disrupted these neoliberal expectations of productivity or institutional expectations of what a complete show can look like. Again, it's tapping into this idea that true disability justice is messy, and oftentimes doesn't fit into these kind of nonprofit industrial complexes. And it's about understanding that our bodies and our minds can be too wild to fit into these structures. Now, this exhibition was actually the last one that Tangled had before we were closed because of the lockdowns. And when we reopened, we were far better equipped to think through these ideas. The next exhibition that we had was called Undeliverable. And in this photo, I've got a white wall with just the word undeliverable. It's been I personally hand painted those words. They are not the cleanest, but I painted them in black wash. Essentially, after the hidden exhibition had been mounted, because we closed, many of our exhibitions were delayed. And we ended up having an exhibition curated by an artist named Carmen Papalia. Carmen worked with a number of other artists, and the idea for the exhibition was about reimagining the museum through the demands and desires of the disabled body mind and challenging institutional structures to center mutual accountability. One of the artists, Jess Sash, identified that a lot of times the most inaccessible thing about working with museums is that they claim to want disabled folks, they claim to want disability culture, but as soon as it pushes against a hard deliverable, suddenly that sort of desire is thrown away to the comforts of your typical institutional need for the deliverables. And so the artist ended up deciding that the name of the show should be Undeliverable, and we should really have a space to honor things like crip time. Crip time, as Alison Kafer, another disability academic, says, is about rather than bending disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. And I think the name of Undeliverable was really attempting to reference this in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way. It was about challenging conventional access by subverting who was prioritizing, not the audiences, but the actual crip artists participating in the show. And in this case, the idea of Undeliverable was really about creating a place in which we could honor the politics of institutional critique. It was about dematerialization and about instead setting up the space so that we could honor disabled bodies and minds. something else that had really happened during this time, Tangled, as I said, was in a much better place to think these things through. Alongside the development of the curatorial aspect of this show, we had started developing what we call a care clause into our contracts. The care clause essentially says that no matter thinking through the needs or the different kind of institutional demands of a contract, none of these things ever supersede the health and well-being of an artist. And so the care clause is our attempt to fit into this colonial kind of structure a bit of the ways that we can create disability justice, that we can create care, and we can create access based on a socio-emotional need rather than a logistical one. So that socio-emotional care can instead come from a place of respect and care and mutual support. It also means that access can continue to be creative and can continue to take risks in ways that it might not be able to otherwise. I had a few other examples, but I also wanted to leave some time for questions. So I'll leave us with this last example of creative access. Here, I've got a photo of a staff member giving a tour using an iPad on a tripod. And I just want to mention this. This is another way in which Tangled created access after the lockdowns. We recognize that a lot of our community is high risks, that folks wouldn't be comfortable visiting a gallery at that time or maybe ever. And so we started offering these virtual ways of experiencing the gallery. And since then, we've been able to start offering actual independent tours. We acquired this robot called Rosa, which you can book a 30-minute tour. You get a guest pass, and this is all free, of course, and you can navigate the robot from your own home. So whether it's any reason that you can't physically come, whether it's geographical or access-based, you can book a tour to visit the gallery in that kind of a way as well. So I'm going to leave us with this example of, access. And I wanted to just kind of close this out by saying there's an author named Joseph Grigley who says in the book Curating Access that Amanda Ketchia put together, in the end, we're reminded that access has a history that's part of the umbrella of body criticism and has intersectional references across the human condition. In America, the Americans for Disabilities Act didn't provide closure on access. The ADA instead made possible the access battles that we're still fighting today. This is what makes the gallery a courtroom and a courtroom a gallery. In both, there's a desire for justice alongside a desire for art that does more than just hang on the walls. So, with about 2 minutes to spare, I will stop sharing my slides.
Well, then I'll just go ahead and say thank you, Sean. That was so informative, really, really important. Deirdre Tompkins says thank you so much, Sean, for this opportunity. Just really great to be able to hear what you guys are doing, and excellent work happening at Tangled. So thank you very much.